Hi, my name is Jean Chandler. I'm a historical aggregator and researcher associated with the historical fencing resurgence that's been going on for the last 20 years. I'm a specialist in the context of the historical fencing manuals and the places where they came from, particularly Central Europe and the free cities in that area. I have been watching an interesting series of podcasts on YouTube by a guy named Oskar who focuses a lot on Messerfechten, fighting with the Messer. It's one of my favorite weapons. And he also likes to get into the historical context of a lot of issues that come up in the fencing community, in the historical fencing world, which I really appreciate because that's what I do. That's my wheelhouse. I like the context. And he points out that he'll make issues a little more complicated sometimes, and I do that too. And I hope Oskar will forgive me for making one of his recent videos a little more complicated, perhaps, because I just saw one in the series that I had a couple of issues with I wanted to bring up. This was called Sword versus Spear, or something like that, and it's focusing on the issue in the historical fencing community that seems to come up every so often, where the interwebs have discovered the fact that that reach is a factor when you're fighting with weapons, handheld weapons, and swords are at a strong initial disadvantage usually against battlefield weapons. You know, swords are usually sidearms. They're one of many sidearms. I would also correct Oskar. You got to sort of remind him that we also have axes and maces and hammers and things like that. But the sword was the most popular sidearm for a really long time. There are some types of swords that were also battlefield weapons. There's some specific periods in history where swords were used as primary weapons. That's very rare. It's certain kinds of swords like montantes, or certain periods, specific types of cavalry in the 19th century that sort of focused on using swords. But for the most part, the sword is always a sidearm. And reach really does matter in a fight when you're using hand weapons. However, I do think this is a more complicated issue. And my biggest problem with that video is something that Oskar said. It was a little bit of a throwaway. He just sort of mentioned offhand that we have this notion that there's this professionalization of warfare that happens in the late medieval period and into the early modern. That's true. Warfare becomes professional. Actually, it had already been professional for, even in the high medieval period, in the sense that a lot of it's being done by mercenaries and military contractors, condottieri, Hauptmann, captains of these units, these Haufen, and that's correspondingly that there's a decline in the use and effectiveness of peasant levies, and he kind of lumps in burgher militias with that. And I just want to inject a nuance to this line of reasoning. There's some truth in it, and peasant levies, feudal levies in general, declined in usefulness, and this included both the peasant levies, which has already more or less disappeared from princely armies, already in the 14th century to a large extent, but also the petty nobility, the lower ranking nobility, were no longer often working out very well in large scale armies, and they were being reorganized in specific manners, such as you see in France and in Poland. But it's an oversimplification, because I think when you look at the armies of commoners, the armies of burghers and peasants, in areas where they had retained their martial tradition, which includes most of the free cities and some rural areas too, they actually performed very well in combat and continue to when they were fighting for themselves. There's a difference between more or less being coerced to fight for the cause of the prince or the duke or the king, just for an agenda that you may not be that invested in, versus fighting to protect your own country or for your own interests, whether they're predatory or defensive. So the classic example of that is the Swiss Confederation. That's what everybody's pretty aware of, that the Swiss were dominant for quite a while, for about 150 years in warfare in Central Europe, and although their total dominance in the sort of simpler formations they used as mercenaries in Italy came to an end, and they made a policy decision to sort of pull out of the Italian wars that were going on there in the 16th century. Even after they sort of went to their neutrality stance, you can still see the burghers of Bern, for example, fighting wars of conquest against the Duchy of Savoy, and quite successfully. Another really good example where commoners, levies, and militia were doing very well is the Hussite Wars in Bohemia, which is now Czech Republic, starting in the first quarter of the 15th century, going on for about 10 years, and then flaring up again in the 1460s, which a lot of people don't seem to remember. These people were heretics, according to the Catholic Church, and they basically called a crusade against them, and the flower of chivalry from all over Europe, from France, Burgundy, England, Spain, every part of the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, etc., came into Bohemia with the intent of correcting the errors of these people, which usually was going to mean burning and pillaging, raping and killing. And instead, they were the ones that got killed. They got wrecked. And, even in the Low Countries, I'm not an expert on the Low Countries, that's where Oskar's from, I can think of a couple of examples where the commoners were quite formidable. So the famous case is the Battle of Golden Spurs, where, admittedly under princely leadership, the Flemish militia, armed with their golden dogs, their big two-handed sort of combination mace, spear weapons, they defeated and crushed the flower of French chivalry in some marshes there. And there's another example also in some marshland, where there's this area called the Dithmarschen. This is basically peasants. There's some very small towns in there, so they have some burghers too, but essentially they're rural people who had their own little rural militia, and this was an area that had some appeal to princely rulers. So we had the Dukes of Schleswig-Holstein coming in there repeatedly, the King of Denmark, and they too were all pretty well annihilated multiple times. And I also saw where Oskar, it looks like he's doing on social media, I saw that he's doing something for Dutch TV about Pierre, who's kind of a folk hero. He's supposed to be this giant guy, but he was based on a real figure that's documented in history. He was the leader of an uprising also from that same area of Frisia that was able to win multiple victories on land and sea, taking on the armies of the Dutch and the Burgundians, and then later the Habsburgs, and the Dutch Navy, which was no slouch. And he was sinking multiple ships in different battles and so on. But once again, here they were fighting originally due to the depredations of a Lanzknecht company that was causing all kinds of havoc when they weren't paid in that area, a very common problem with mercenaries. And these people were fighting for their own land. Now, ultimately, they did have to back down to the overpowering might of Charles V, but so did all the princes of Northern Europe. All the Protestant dukes, had to also knuckle under to Charles V eventually, because he had all the silver from the New World and so forth financing his armies. Anyway, those are some examples. I think that we have a phenomenon where a fair amount of the sources from the 15th, 16th century were written for the people who paid the most, who were the patrons of art and literature, which were the princes themselves, the dukes and the kings, and they didn't necessarily want to read about victories of commoners. And then, when they had this wave of resurgence of interest in the 18th, 19th century, once again, we have a bunch of monarchs. We have a bunch of, very wealthy aristocrats who are kind of bankrolling a lot of this, and so a lot of our perception of history is tailored to the taste of those people. I don't want this to go too long, so I'm just going to very briefly touch on the technical side of this, which is, yes, spears have an initial strong advantage, but we do have historical examples of things like the rodoleros, where they're fighting with a steel shield and a like a cut thrust sword, very effective against pikes. I think montante were as well, and I also think that even with a long sword, you have a chance if you actually train for it, which most of us haven't done yet. But I'll get to that in another video. Thank you.